think how in just a few short years we have moved from the early thrill of internet engaged communities to dystopian anxiety. And it gives me personal hope anyway to participate in conversations like this one, because looking at this room here on a school night, here when you could have been home watching Hulu or flat earth theories on YouTube, or maybe even in a political debate, you've chosen instead to be here and to think some hard thoughts about the future facing us. Tonight we're going to be talking about a wide range of issues focused around three basic questions. One, how can we regain some sense of control over our political destiny with all of the media and social media manipulation that we see lots of people using to great effect? When I say great, I just mean consequential effect. Two, what can we learn from examples like Brexit? Three, how can we bolster journalists trying to do the good work of educating us to be empowered citizens within this current media environment? I should mention we have Q&A after our song and dance is done. And so there are cards, and there will be people, I believe Barbie in particular, will be passing out cards. So please write your ideas down and she'll pass them on up. And then I'll just make sure that we don't have three people asking the same question, or, beating up on one particular guy. So with that said, I'm going to introduce our gentleman here tonight. And I'm going to do it alphabetically so I can't be accused of bias. We've got George Broad, recently former journalism professor at City University of London, a go-to media pundit for the BBC, managing editor of The Times, so no slouch there. Quentin Hardy, Director of Editorial at Google Cloud, former New York Times Deputy Tech Editor, and Richard Gingras, Vice President of News at Google. Some of his key handiwork includes the Google News Initiative, supporting sustainable quality journalism, and he was also there, I believe, at the creation for Salon. So some of you old-timers will recognize that for the impressive thing that it is. With that said, I think in that same order, I'll have each person come up and talk for a few minutes, and just share some basic thoughts to kick us off and get us thinking deeper.
Thank you very much indeed, Rachel. It was when you mentioned song and dance that I got really worried. No song and dance from me, I'm afraid. I think if you were expecting to hear about the enormous number of themes that are in this title, you might be expecting to hear about two things in particular. What we might call techlash, the backlash against high technology and the platforms. The latest scandalous revelations about what Facebook or Google or Twitter have been up to. There are bad headlines, most particularly probably about Facebook all of the time. The worries about deepfake videos, are they responsible for the national populism, the rises of this kind of stuff? And secondly, you will probably be expecting to hear about the crisis in journalism, the disappearance of newspapers, the hollowing out of newsrooms, and for the newsrooms that are still operating, the assault on the journalists from the White House and elsewhere. I'm going to touch on both of those, but first I want to do something else and try and look a bit behind the chatter and the recent headlines. I think if we look at underlying causes of what's going on, we may be able to see more clearly what we should be doing. And here's a quick clue. These are issues which are unlikely to be solved by technological innovation. Technology will help, but the choices that we're facing in these things are moral, political, democratic. Information power has shifted. One of the things it's done is shift towards platforms like Facebook, Google, Twitter. And when you have a power shift, there ought to be some choices about how it's being distributed. Indeed, the distribution of power can be a definition of politics. The internet has obviously rewired what some people like to call the public sphere. We learn and discuss about what is happening in new ways. And there are two aspects of that matter that really matter, I think, for this evening's theme. Social networks connect people, but they make no explicit ranking between them as to the quality, importance, or accuracy of what is being shared, or written, or expressed. Everyone's expertise is apparently as good as anyone else's. And second important aspect, online information does not need to include any clues about where it comes from. Needless to say, as people rightly celebrated the choice and the voice which social networks provided, the kind of dangers that lurk in those two things I've just been describing were underappreciated. Social networks and search engines are not, in the old-fashioned sense of the word, media organizations, but I would say that they are part of the infrastructure of free speech, and therefore they're very important to basic freedoms. And realization that there were more problems about online communication than people initially realized coincided, of course, with a cascade of political crises in Europe and the US. Resentment and mistrust of elites, recession or economic standstill, emergence of parties whose appeal lay in their not being established parties. A lot of this is characterized as the rise of the far right. Accurate up to a point, but it's more accurate to say that what's going on is a de-alignment from mainstream political parties. Just a few quick examples. The socialist parties in Germany and France, which 15 years ago were a major part of the political... Let me see if I can slot it in here. Am I audible once again?
No.
Yes.
Depends on your
I'll just back up half a sentence. The socialist parties of Germany and France, 15 years ago, major parts of the political furniture in their countries, dominant political parties are in crisis. Both those countries, they're scoring in the low teens in the opinion polls. Their influence and power that was really at a peak quite recently has gone, and they've been challenged from both the right and the left. In Spain, you have a new party, roughly speaking, on the left, Podemos, and you have a new party, brand new party on the far right, Vox. In the US, of course, yes, you have Mr. Trump, President Trump, but you also have Bernie Sanders. UK, yes, the Conservative Party zinging away, lurching away to the right, but the Brexit Party, led by Nigel Farage, is picking up votes from disillusioned Labour voters, as UKIP, the party he led before, did before that. Over the last 3 years, the Labour Party ought to have been shredding the Conservatives, given the extraordinary clown show that has been going on since the Brexit referendum in 2016. That hasn't happened because Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party, is not himself a Remainer. He would prefer, I think, to leave the EU, and he's anyway not up to the job. Now for a health warning. It is extremely tempting to attribute this upheaval to manipulation by social media. Try to resist this temptation. This is not to excuse bad actors. In the UK, the Leave campaign remain under investigation for breaches of data protection. They've already been fined for that. And there's a criminal investigation going on into their spending in the referendum. But it is to say that we're looking at very long, deep political trends here. And just as an aside, the evidence that social media messages and ads change the votes of people is proving very hard to find. There are a lot of researchers out trying to do it. Roughly speaking, the initial results are social media messages are mostly consumed by people whose state of mind that will consolidate and affirm. In other words, the evidence that it actually flips votes is very elusive indeed. One example of how all these questions are not quite as not quite as simple, I beg your pardon, as they look. During the Brexit campaign in 2016, there was a Facebook ad about Turkey. Most people who have ever had anything to do with the EU know that the EU membership of Turkey is somewhere between extremely unlikely and impossible. Somewhere on that spectrum. The ad had Turkey and a map and large arrows going towards the UK, and it highlighted Syria and Iraq, who of course have borders with Turkey. And the ad said, this is about to be your new border, because in the EU there is freedom of movement, so if Turkey did join the EU, Turks would have freedom of movement. Freedom of movement might even involve refugees from Syria and Iraq. Is that a lie? As a matter of judgment, I would say that it is. But is it really a good idea for us to start trying to classify that as a lie? Who would do that classifying if we were having an election campaign or even a second referendum campaign about Brexit? Competing politicians always stretch the truth. I live in a marginal parliamentary constituency in southwest London, and I don't need social networks to get nonsense from politicians in an election campaign, because we're in a marginal. It comes through our letterbox every single day, several times. You can't filter election material or any other political material by a truth test. I know that Facebook have been retreating since 2016 over almost every aspect of political advertising, but nevertheless we have to be very, very careful about anything we should do about that. So the 2016 Brexit referendum was polluted by lies, no question, but the fundamental reason that it did was the meeting of two forces. That decade of political disillusion, the crash, and all of the things that I mentioned, long hostility and disinterest in the EU. Did some of the media have a role in doing that? Yes. And a lot of resentment of the elite for cronyism and corruption. And that mixed with a long-running civil war inside the Conservative Party. And that has produced, as you will undoubtedly have seen over the last few weeks, a really weird situation. The Conservative Party, solid piece of the British political furniture for as long as anyone can remember, and in power in the UK, I think for more time in my lifetime than any other political party, has been taken over by a faction in a kind of Leninist, Maoist style. On Wednesday morning, 3 Scottish judges ruled that the Johnson government, Johnson the Prime Minister, had unlawfully suspended its own parliament in an attempt to force through Brexit. That's judges defending a parliament elected by around 46 million people against a Prime Minister elected by around 92,000 members of the Conservative Party. He became Prime Minister by taking over as leader of his own party without an election. And in addition, I think, last factor in this list is the extraordinary latitude that the political authorities have allowed the high-tech platforms. Putting all this together, somebody recently asked our great novelist Salman Rushdie, what is the biggest problem of all in the world? And he replied, our collective inability to agree on the nature of reality. There are such conflicting descriptions of how things are that it becomes difficult to make agreements that allow people to move forward. And Rushdie is right. Our problem is truth decay, the shrinking space where people can agree about facts and evidence. People sometimes wonder why politicians like Trump don't seem worried about being caught lying. But doubt is his product. Muddy the waters, blur people's view of the world. What can we do about this? Well, there's quite a bit happening already. There's a lot of fact-checking going on. If you're ever interested in fact-checking, I would name-check just one organisation here called First Draft, run by the brilliant Claire Wardle. There is an interesting experiment going on in Canada, who have a general election coming quite soon. There are some really quite stiff rules they've started to operate on preparing to try and stop manipulation in the election. The BBC, the tech giants and the publishers, Richard may well have been involved in this, or his colleagues have been, and an alliance to try and do early morning alerts on misinformation and disinformation in elections. There is, of course, education and training in what people call, I don't really like this phrase, media literacy. My personal favourite is a group of journalists in Belgium called lie detectors, who go into schools with quite young kids, 9, 10, 11, and do them little quizzes on how can you tell what is accurate and what is not. teaching them better cognitive muscles for skepticism, but I agree that's a longer phrase than media literacy. Another thing we can do is use international human rights law to help us balance free expression and the prevention of harm. One of the odd things, and you're an audience from around here, so you may have better insight into this than I do, but one of the odd things about the high-tech giants is their extraordinary reluctance to use philosophy and history and precedent and codes to guide them trying to solve problems which editors, politicians, lawyers, philosophers have been trying to solve for really quite a long time, indeed into centuries. And for example, if you're worried about anti-vaccine material on the web, anti-vaccination campaigns, and you're a doctor and you think this is outrageous, you can look at the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights and see that it will allow restrictions on free speech for public health reasons. It's an interesting example of an opportunity. I think, therefore, that the high-tech companies have civic responsibilities. Some of these are obviously legal responsibilities dealing with hate speech, whatever it is. But I think others are more diffuse. I think they have a responsibility for the quality of public reason. And I think doing that, we should all try and help them focus on two things. One is not publication or expression, but it is amplification. And here I think possibly there may be a technological solution. If a piece of disinformation or misinformation is taking off at great speed, is it possible to, if not stop it, at least slow it down? And the other thing, apart from amplification, that I think we should concentrate on is curation. No one wants Google, Facebook, Twitter, or anybody else to stop people expressing themselves. But, as I'm sure you're about to hear from Richard, these networks already curate what people are saying. Their algorithms rank things. Richard posted on the Google blog only today about tightened criteria for ranking news stories that appear in Google searches. I'm sure we'll say more about that in a minute. Facebook, in what a friend of mine at Oxford has called a bit of cautious glasnost, is in the business of creating a content oversight board, which in theory at least so far will be independent and tell Facebook whether it should put up or take down, in response to appeals from users, pieces of material. This is all good as far as it goes, but I think it is rather unaccountable. It leaves out really independent inspection of what the high-tech platforms are doing. And that leads me to transparency. We cannot audit or make accountable what is going on in the black boxes of the algorithms unless we know what is happening. And I think law is probably going to be needed to work out that transparency. There are complicated issues, but I think it's necessary. Lastly, what can we do? We can defend and pay for journalism and help experiments. Buy quality journalism. It's one of the best things you can do. Doesn't matter which kind of quality journalism it is, just buy it. There's no silver bullet to these problems. Some of the fire from the hip suggestions about regulating online or social networks will almost certainly lurch into restricting free speech unduly. Earlier this year, a very distinguished political psychologist called Sean Rosenberg shocked a meeting of political psychologists by saying he thought it quite possible that democracy might just fail worldwide. His argument was that democracy is hard to do. People find it really boring and hard work to study it, study all the stuff you need to know. And he said, I'm not sure that people have the energy or appetite. And elites are losing control of the institutions designed to protect us from our worst instincts. You don't have to agree with his argument to see the warning in there. So it's down to us. Thank you.
Richard, up to you whether you want to speak from there or here. It's all good.
I'll pick up both.
Okay.
so much to talk about. I'm not going to take all of our time, though frankly it would be hard for me to do so. Let me maybe start off by just giving you, like, what does it mean to be Vice President of News at Google? Yeah. I don't have reporters. I don't make editorial decisions. I work with engineers. We do everything with computer science. We do it at vast scale. We put news in front of 1 billion people a day. We send roughly that many visits to news organizations every day. So it's obviously a significant role that we play in the ecosystem, and one that we take very seriously. So what does that mean?
Did you put up the volume? Or put the
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, can we turn up the volume?
Yes.
Great. And I'll simply talk more loudly. No?
The other thing you can do is...
It's easy to forget to keep talking loudly.
Oh, I'm very good at talking loudly. I can assure you that. If there's one thing I can do, is talk loudly. So, as I was saying.
You can also hold the mic up.
Yeah. Okay. There are three dimensions of my role. One is I do oversee and guide our strategies whereby we surface news on Google surfaces, including Google Search. When you see news on Google Search, that's coming out of teams that I work with. If you use the Google News app, that is also out of the teams that I work with. If you use one of our smart speakers and ask a question about the news, that's also something that my teams do. That's one dimension, how we present news to those 1 billion users a day. The second part is actually, I think, even more interesting, which is I oversee our efforts whereby we are developing products and running initiatives to really work with the news industry globally to rethink the future of news, which I think is massively important, and I could easily spend 45 minutes on that alone, because that indeed is what needs to happen, because the world is a very different one. And what it means to do journalism in this world is a very different one. And the range of those efforts go from providing tools to help news organizations drive subscription revenue and membership revenue, tools to explore new storytelling formats, tools for the newsroom. I have a team in Israel that's using machine learning to build tools for investigative journalists to better do their jobs in understanding large corporate documents. So there's a lot of stuff that we're doing on the product development side. I also oversee the Google News Initiative, where we're investing some $300 million in driving innovation in the space. We, for instance, originally we were the first funders of Claire Wardle in First Draft. I helped found something called the Trust Project, which I'll touch on a little bit later, to try to promote transparency in the sources of information. We created the original schema that fact checkers use, such that fact checks can be better understood and surfaced in areas like Google Search. So there's a tremendous amount of important work that we're doing there in collaboration with the news industry. And then the third thing is, as I often say, because of my gray hair and the faux gravitas that it suggests, and the fact that, as George mentioned, around the world, the globe is woken up to the impact of the internet on our societies. And I spend no small amount of time speaking to politicians and regulators, and the bucket list item that I didn't know I had of testifying before Parliament. It's an interesting gig, I will not deny that, and it's an extraordinarily important one. I think in many regards I'm the luckiest person in the world, except when I think about the enormous challenges that confront us. And so I want to take this up a notch first, and I'm in almost entire agreement with what George has said, but I want to take it up a notch. Because I think too often in these discussions, the discussions and the angst and the emotion revolves around the tech players. And don't get me wrong, we have a role to play. There are lots of things that we can do better. I will note that the term platforms drives me crazy, because those four companies often referred to are dramatically different companies with dramatically different business motivations and so on, which is fine. But it's a mistake to simply focus on the tech platforms. It's a huge mistake to focus on the tech platforms. So let's just start at the core. The internet put a printing press in everyone's hands. And that's been extraordinary, as we all know. People have access to information like they have never had in the history of civilization. People have access to medical information that they never had available before. Farmers in underdeveloped areas have access to market information that might help them be less screwed by the middleman. So on and so forth. Tremendous benefits. I don't think any of us would want to roll that back. But put a printing press in everyone's hands. Enable free expression to its exponential degree. Brings challenges to our societies, as we know. As I have often pointed out, I think, and as you suggest from that quote about democracies, which I frankly agree with, how do democracies survive and thrive in environments of unfettered free expression? Sounds like a paradox, and it is. Though Plato once pointed out, I am a humanities grad, that democracies will destroy themselves based on the liberties that they enable. And I think there's a real challenge there. The internet, for instance, is intrinsically divisive. And I don't mean divisive in a confrontational sense. I mean divisive in the sense that if you want to unify a society, Kim Jong-il has the right idea in Korea. We give you all the information you need and no conflict at all. We can go back to the early days of media in the United States when we had 3 commercial networks and we had the notion, which may or may not have been valid, of Uncle Walter Cronkite dealing, helping us go through the hard times. Now we have 1 million, more than that, channels of information, and everyone can find the information that suits their interests and their needs. And one of the unfortunate things about the human species, we talk about human reason. We somehow think human reason means we have the innate ability to understand abstract concepts. Truth is, the evolution of human reason is entirely in the social construct. Entirely in the social construct. If the head of my tribe tells me the moon is green, I'm going to agree with him because I might not get a leg of the calf. And that extends to all of us to this day. We prefer affirmation to information. It's a particular challenge, and I think we have to recognize that as we seek to address this. So we've enabled free expression in ways beyond, I think, which any of us have ever imagined. The metaphor for free expression is Hyde Park, the box in the Speaker's Corner. And indeed, we have the right to say anything we want. But of course, metaphorically, or not metaphorically, in reality, doing that in Hyde Park, I could say anything I wanted and it would carry as far as my voice could carry. I did not have the innate right to a broadcast license. That is indeed what we have today with the internet. We have each and every one of us has the ability to fling information far and wide. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with that? Misinformation and disinformation. How are we describing that? Too often it gets very simplistic and we talk about bad actor states, we talk about Macedonian teenagers. Let's not kid ourselves. And that's important, don't get me wrong, but that's one small piece, right? If you look at what MIT's analysis of the last election, what they said the real impact on the last election wasn't Macedonian teenagers. It was a highly partisan press and political organizations that had incredible ability to spew various messages to various of their bases, right? This is a society problem. Let's not kid ourselves. We had the unfortunate terror incident in Christchurch, for instance, and the shooter's video was out there, and understandably, social networks like Facebook, our own YouTube, was criticized, like, take them down, take them down, take them down, and indeed we did. But at the same time, tabloids in the UK, satellite channels in Australia were constantly putting out clips of that video and causing people to go to the internet and find them, and if they did in a dark corner of the internet, sharing them with everyone else. Right? It's a very complex problem, and it goes far beyond the simplicity of tech platforms. Again, not to suggest that we don't have a key role here, but our role is not and should not be as the arbiters of what is acceptable or unacceptable free expression. But we can address it. To me, one of the challenging things, as I said, I often deal in the political space today, is too often what we're seeing in response to misinformation is either well-intentioned or sometimes not so well-intentioned efforts by governments to corral free expression. The secondary consequences are vast and troubling and challenging. And the one thing I say in those discussions is be careful when you talk about misinformation, or when you say, gee, Google, you should take down that piece of misinformation, which, by the way, with Google search, the web, we don't take things down from the web. That's not the answer. It's not about parsing bits of fake expression. However, what we do today, and maybe laws could help with this, is how can we better understand and deal with those who work under fraudulent identities and use various mechanisms to spew viral content in insidious ways. Right? We spend a lot of time doing that. We have a vast number of people trying to figure out where are those robotic networks that are coming out to bad actor states, and how can we make sure to push them down before they cause undue harm. So it's an extraordinary challenge addressing the weaponized behaviors of those who fraudulently distribute it at scale. And yes, we're in the middle of it. Google is in the middle of it, like no other company in this regard. We're in the middle of the internet. With Google search, there's an interesting and fundamental tension to what we do with Google search. On the one hand, we strive for many good motivations, including our business interests, to give people the most authoritative and relevant information to any topic you question us about. And overall, I think we actually do a remarkable job of that. The trust in Google goes far beyond the trust in any media outlet today. But that doesn't mean that there aren't things that we can do better. But there are fundamental tensions. So whereas on the one hand, we strive to surface the most authoritative content, you can craft a query to find information in the dark corners of the internet, as you should be able to, right? Google search should allow you to find anything that's findable in the corpus of legal expression in the domain in which you live, right? In Germany, we won't surface content in Germany that suggests that the Holocaust did not happen, because that's against the law. Note that with the First Amendment here, which we are at the extreme in the world of rights of free expression, the word truth is not there, as it should not be. But that obviously presents its own degree of difficulties. But as I said, a fundamental tension. Because if you craft a query, if I craft a query and say, gee, peach pits as a cancer cure, you will find information out there that says that it does. Right? If you narrow that query, to whatever, you'll find the bad information out there, as you should. It's important we understand what's going on in the dark corners of the internet as a society, as journalists would want us to do. So we have to recognize that. But there is that fundamental tension on the one hand of surfacing the most authoritative, and on the other hand, recognizing and trying to address the fact that there is bad information out there. We take many different approaches to trying to address this. As I was mentioning earlier, with regard to health information, we're not going to take bad information down, but I do believe in the principle that the best way ultimately to overcome bad information is to have good information. So for instance, we're working with, as a model project with the National Academy of Sciences, saying, what can we do to help and encourage you to take that vast repository of great scientific information and make it more easily findable on search, right? That's the kind of thing I think that we can do to help with these things.
I'm going to encourage you to wrap up.
And I will. A couple of further things here. To what extent can we address this through better methods of identity and accountability? As I said, I helped found something called the Trust Project, which is largely about how can we encourage news organizations to be more transparent about who they are, both the reporters, the nature of the organization, and so on. Because I do want to skew our results very strongly towards sources who are authoritative and who are willing to stand behind their words with their identities. But again, these are challenges. Societies may be ruled by laws, but their true health is guided by norms. Whatever we do as a society, if we don't address the norms, I don't know how we achieve this. Let me give you the following, I think, compelling and poignant statement. Is the internet to the First Amendment what the AK-47 is to the Second? We have the right to own an AK-47. We have a right to free expression. The only thing that allows our societies to be healthy is to the extent that we have norms to guide our behavior. And obviously that's what we're seeing deteriorating in significant ways in our society today. Is we've got people tearing down our institutions at the same time that we're trying to build them up or build new ones. So it's a challenge, and there are many, many things I could talk about. There's a lot of stuff that we're trying to do on the good side. Everything from, again, how do we create new models for local journalism? How do we create, there's an effort, and I'll close on this, there's an effort I'm working on at Google, which I call the Common Knowledge Project, which to address what I think is a pretty compelling and important problem, and I'll do it by example. Last year there was the unfortunate attack on the British Parliament. 4 people died. In the United States, our cable news networks went basically wall to wall for 3 days. Attractive visuals, compelling story. Never in that coverage did I hear them make any mention of the fact that since 9/11 there were like 23 people killed by terrorists in the United States. Nor did they cover the fact that on each of those 3 days there were mass murders of 4 or more people. How do we help people get a sense of context about the stories that occur? Right? News, by its definition, focuses on anomalistic events. But if we don't give them the statistical context to understand those stories, I'm going to the poll in Ames, Iowa, voting on my fears of terrorism versus the fact that maybe not enough people are graduating from high schools. So one of the things that we're doing with this project is gathering as much data, government data and beyond, into a corpus to make it easier for journalists and ourselves to take that information and surface it attractively in context, to help you understand what's important and what's not. It's just one of the many dimensions. But as I said, there's a lot to do here. This is a multifaceted problem and requires multifaceted solutions and requires the participation of everyone. And frankly, if our political leaders aren't willing to stand up and guide us with better norms, I'm not sure we'll get out the other side. Right? I mean, one other thing Plato did predict in the dialogues, by the way, is the natural progression of governmental structures from oligarchy to democracies, which are great but messy. No one is ever fully satisfied, and it sets them up in a perfect way for populist leaders. And the internet has obviously done a pretty good job of fueling that to happen, and that's where we are today. So I do have my own concerns about the future of democracy. And I hope we can do all we can to stand up the role of the free press, to stand up our ability to, in a sense, get good fact-based information into people's heads so that we can actually get through this and get to the other side. Glad to discuss further. Sorry for going on.
Well, I'd like to begin by asking you to put yourself in my position following those two. Well, I come at this from a somewhat different direction. I'm kind of gratified that the Venn diagram we're creating has some overlaps here, and that's a healthy sign of a means toward truth or concord. But I do come at it at a different point. The good news is I think the 2020 election is in a much healthier place than the 2016 election for a number of reasons. There are a lot of very, very fierce people watching the media environment in a way they weren't before, and watching the voting registration environment in a way they weren't before. The fact that our government can seem to pass a voting safety law is not helpful, but I'm sure there are a lot of highly motivated people who will be looking at that. So it will be hard to have the kind of squishy anomalies one might have before. But the more problematic news is we're not going back. We are not going back to pre-Trump. We are living in this world now. This is who we are. And it won't be Trump per se, but I think he exemplifies certain things that are evidence of a very difficult kind of mental state we are in collectively, that he leverages extremely well. And I would actually frame the problem not so much as a news problem as a public health problem. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit now. And I don't speak for Google in this. I do not work in the news side of Google. I work in the cloud side. And I'm there because I lectured at Cal for many years about the relationship between very important technologies and consciousness. And that's how I see the problem we have today. This is a public health problem around the current state of consciousness, to put it somewhat grandiosely. The good news is we've been there before. Technology has done this kind of thing before, and people do learn to adjust. And George, I went to the Brexit party page today because I was curious, what is Farage's game after Brexit? And sure enough, at the bottom of the page, it says, this is not only about the EU, this is about what sort of democratic country we live in. We're out to challenge the self-serving two-party system, make the people sovereign, and restore trust in our democracy. That's a tension you could have found between the Enlightenment and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that was blown up when the dominant Industrial Revolution and late imperialism just completely remade the social landscape in the 19th century. And you could argue in some ways we're working that out, but we're in a much more closer in situation, economically and socially, that is causing this, what I would call a public health problem. I think it's important to sort of not just look at the internet and its economic and social characters, but the precursors that cause that. Technologies are neutral, and they embed in a certain context of the times. And fake news or sensationalistic news or the manipulation of people goes back a long way. But in particular, I would point to the period in the 80s and the 90s of cable television and talk radio, when Moore's Law drove down the costs of technologies and deregulation enabled a lot more voices. And this was seen as a good, but it also created a lot of information anxiety, a lot of information overload, and a lot of sort of more personalized content. Right at a time when, in post-war America, we were seeing rich home entertainment undermining small-scale civic institutions. If you know the whole bowling alone theory, that's a good example of it. The death of Lions clubs and the fall in scouting, the loss of a kind of collective feeling as people moved into gated communities and specialty shopped because they were having very bespoke relationships with the marketplace and not encountering strangers or people unlike them in the democracy. The death of national service might be another example. And we have a harder time in this democracy encountering strangers, and that will harden our points of view a little bit because we don't casually learn about people who aren't like us the way we might have not so long ago. And this wrote in perfectly with a certain distrust of officialdom, with the press being compliant. Well, if you go with the Gulf of Tonkin, the revelations of the Church Committee in the 70s, the idea that NAFTA was going to be painless and how that was sold by most elite media, the first Iraq War. I knew the guy at Hill and Knowlton who had the Kuwait account and sold that to the American media. The second Gulf War, and then the 2008 collapse of, without real consequences for the political and financial elites. There's a lot of anger, and this comes along just as the internet, in particular Web 2.0 and social media kick in. So it's riding these trends and just bang, hitting home so well, right? And that's the perfect kind of nest, just as the cynicism and the sensationalism that are characteristic of these are necessary because people are having an intellectual overload, an information overload. It's all coming at them too fast. And there's an interesting psychological phenomenon where this happens, which is you tend to harden in your position. You don't want conflicting information. You want supporting information. And your opinions tend to become kind of compartmentalized. If you are a fundamentalist Christian, you are probably also pro-gun. You are also, these things kind of form into really hard groups. And that makes it easier to sort of wish ill on your enemy. The idea of owning the libs, or the idea, many people who are against Trump hope he gets a recession. This is a terrible thing. Millions of people will suffer, and yet he will suffer. So on both sides, you've got this weird mental anxiety going on, where the other side has to be wrong. And that's a characteristic of this problem. Now, where journalism is concerned, the economics have changed totally. And that's a huge problem feeding into this. It's very cheap to put out news. It's very hard to get paid for news. Time was newspapers basically owned the time and space of information. If you had a newspaper for Milwaukee, if there was a car dealership going to have a sale on Saturday, it had to advertise on Wednesday because that paper owned the time and space of information. The internet doesn't care about time and space. It blows it apart. So the whole ad model goes away, right, basically. And it goes over to internet advertising, which is a very different model involving large scale and cheap returns, but at scale you end up making more money. You can't fund things as easily. I mean, newspapers, even as late as like 2002, the average publishing company had a profit margin twice the Fortune 500. It was so fat, you can't believe it. And it fell apart just unbelievably, and no one knew what to do. That's why I've seen, I'm third generation in the business, but the whole thing just blew apart in the last 15 years, 30% gone. That's like nothing I'd seen growing up. So, fake news is cheaper, fake news gets clicks, fake news can be produced by somebody sitting at their desk just harvesting stuff and assembling it. Fake news can own your enemy, and you want to pass it on to own your enemy and make yourself feel good about your position. You don't want to move out and encounter the other, you just want to kill the other. And then cheap is also an issue for traditional journalism, which may have the best of intentions, but is now in this model where it's kind of bifurcated. You can go for a lot of clicks and hope your internet ads make money, and clickable tends to be sensationalistic, right? Massive clicks don't go to thought through, carefully reported, deep things. They go for, you won't believe these 10 pictures of actresses' feet, right? I don't know. But, or you try to build up a very loyal, thoughtful group that will pay you money. Subscriptions or clickability, right? And inside the subscription base, it has its own certain problems because there's a received wisdom. You can't pivot off and go, wow, we're all wrong. What would that be like? That's anxiety producing too.
And I'm going to encourage you to wrap up.
Okay, so how do we fix all this? First off, I think that's why, by the way, that's why you have so many op-eds in newspapers today. They're totally cheap to produce and they get clicked on a lot because they're opinions. And that's why Michelle Wolf is kind of correct. People are addicted to Trump because everything about him gets a ton of clicks. Now, the next problem in this is politicians are now media companies themselves. They want to be entertainers. It could be Boris, it could be Trump, it could be Salvini in Italy. Every one of them claims to be a voice of the people, which has a certain truth, like what the Brexit Party was saying, but they're also seen as being outrageous truth tellers, and therefore a form of indisputable truth because they're so outrageous. So you can see I'm outlining a kind of public health problem here, where people are in this state of anxiety because there's so much information, and they just fixate into an identity that they're shepherded into as a way of avoiding. How do we fix this? This is where AI becomes kind of interesting, actually. AI is very double-edged. I don't worry about deep fakes because they can be spotted as fakes. I worry about near fakes and appropriations, like when somebody takes a picture of a house on fire and on WhatsApp sends it out to a bunch of the Hindu community and they're saying the Muslims are doing this, or taking it out, and repurposing it to a whole other country where you see it happening. But AI can also spot that stuff by tracking it better. Where I worry about AI is AI targeting individuals better. But the good news there is AI is still kind of expensive to do. So you really won't have, somebody sitting at their desk doing that kind of crazy mass manipulation AI anytime soon. The real way out, though, is to try to leverage the most trusted groups in America to address what really is a kind of public health problem. I would think it would be fantastic if the DOE and the DHHS developed a kind of curricula around consuming information, right? And this would be interesting. I think the guys in Germany bringing in the reporters have it totally wrong because reporters are low trust individuals. In a survey last year, the highest trust individuals in America are nurses, number one, 88%, doctors, about 65%, pharmacists, and then high school teachers, and then cops. Journalists are about 33%. Congressmen are 8% along with telemarketers. I do not make this up. So, why not have the most trusted individuals come in and start talking about, are you checking in with this? Have you thought about, how is your news consumption going? Teach it the way you taught civics before, as a kind of health and hygiene. And actually create less status to people who pass on news that turns out to be fake. Like, take away status points for that. Make that a low status thing to do. And, from the high schools on up, just create an environment where, shit posting and trolling and spreading junk information is considered a low class activity. Because right now it's got cool points. And those can be taken away if you work at it a little bit. My time up?
Your time is up.
Okay, there we go.
Now, I recognize that many of you have been writing some thoughtful questions down, so I promise to just put 3 questions to these guys, and then it's your turn. But I'll start with what Quentin was just talking about, the idea that politicians are down to friends and family in terms of who actually believes them. Yeah, that's perfectly fine. Just remember to turn on the button on the sides here. So we know politicians are gridlocked and corrupt and venal and malicious, and there's a reason why it's called rough and tumble, right? What could or should we be asking government to do to regulate what we're seeing on the interwebs? Because so far they haven't really been doing much of anything, at least in this country.
Well, I'll offer one item. It's probably not the only thing they could be doing, but I think they could enforce better transparency about, am I audible?
Yeah.
Better transparency. If you just take elections, because those are a big preoccupation, we have lots of rules in most countries about exactly how elections are conducted. There are openness rules about spending. There are openness rules about contributions. There are openness rules about how you use advertising. For example, in my own country, the UK, television appearances or television advertising for politics is virtually non-existent. Paid political advertising. That's the way we have to organise it. So there is nothing new or different or exotic or inherently wrong, I don't think, in refereeing properly how you do this. We know incredibly little about how, sorry about this expression, the platforms do this kind of thing. I do realise the platforms are very varied things, but all of them have some role in this, and even if they do not wish to declare their algorithms to the public because they're commercially sensitive, there are in most countries election commissions or the equivalent whose job is to check that those rules are being kept. There is a much greater degree of required transparency that will get us a long way. It's not the only thing, but I'll leave it at that.
I would say 3 things quickly. One, I completely echo a greater transparency with regard to political advertising, but that won't happen because it's not in their interest to do so. I think we can use more uniform rules with regard to the use of data. I like to think of us being very, very cautious and conscious about how we don't ever release personal data to outside third parties. Obviously, there have been players in the ecosystem who have done that by intent or accident, which is usually damaging. And yes, there could be better, I think, legal guidance in that regard. With regard to the algorithms, yes and no. What I will say, algorithmic transparency in and of itself is a terrible idea. And it's not about commercial interests, by the way. I mean, yeah, I can say they're proprietary, but that's the last argument that I would ever use in this. I say it for 2 reasons. One is, people are constantly gaming the algorithms. So to the extent you actually release the algorithm, you're basically making it easier for bad actors. And then the second one is, well, who the hell decides what the algorithm should be in our political world? Really? You want to put that in the hands of the government? Which government? Go around the world and look at your democracies like Hungary, Poland, here. Who do you want to do that? I do think, however, and this is what we try to do, is that I think we have a responsibility to be Transparent about our principles, and there's a 160-page document on the internet that gets very specifically into the principles that guide our algorithms. We should be transparent about our methodologies within the bounds of security. And we should accommodate, and we are accommodating and continuing to expand our accommodation as to allowing academic institutions to audit our work, which they, Google, all Google search results are there, but can we make it easier for them to analyze that? I have no problem with folks analyzing our results and telling us where we get it right and where we get it wrong. When I wake up on a Monday morning and Donald Trump is saying that our rankings are biased, then I was pretty damn pleased that folks like The Economist would come out and say, actually, no, they're not. So I think there are some approaches that we can take there. They're not literally about algorithmic transparency, but they are about approaches and principles that I think can achieve the better end result, and that's something that we'll do proactively, and we'll see where theoretical regulation around the world goes.
The regulation tends to sound about limits. I think there are more positive acts they could do as well, like stopping marking so many things top secret, making it hard to get information about government activity, opening up and cleansing databases so people could do work, and not jailing journalists or otherwise curbing their livelihoods. That'd be cool. Moreover, I think, you heard about what Richard's group announced today involving favoring original reporting, original work. And that's a huge thing because original work is what's expensive, right? And what I like hearing that is that's more likely to get clicks, that's more likely to get rewarded. That's an economic act as much as a truth act. I don't know if that was the intention, but, and likewise, there could be some kind of tax benefit around original reporting, field reporting, so that becomes an incentive for companies to do it better. Lastly, public funding in various forms. I'm not wild about these things, but they are effective. And was it Thornton at Texas Tribune who said, if we could get about half the money that goes to ballet in this country, to go towards news organizations, we'd probably be in okay shape. Something, words to that effect. So those are positives.
How do you look at the tutu?
Fantastic.
We should have all come here dressed for that, and you get an argument with that here.
Yeah.
So here's another question: hate speech. Whether it's a few psychologically bent individuals or malicious political groups, it was sort of received wisdom just a few months ago, really, 18 months. I don't know the product cycle. That it would be better to push them off of relatively public networks like Facebook, and then they just scurried off to 4chan and 8chan and soon 800chan and WhatsApp in places that make it a lot more difficult for journalists to track them down or anybody else for that matter. Was it better? Should we have tried harder to re-socialize bad actors on social media networks?
Can I take that
Sure.
one first? A wonderful thing happened the other day. Milo Yiannopoulos said he can't pay his way doing what he does. Yeah. Getting kicked off of Facebook and Twitter has killed his shtick. He says, he's on all these sort of low audience things. It's like, I'm talking to the same 2,000 guys all the time. None of you are paying. This is no good. He was actually at this whining session. Couldn't happen to a nicer guy. So that stuff actually was kind of effective.
For some people. We're still seeing race riots.
There's no question, to the extent that we can identify it and make sure that it's not prominent, we should do so. We should all recognize that also in the United States, the laws on hate speech, the bar is very, very high. You basically have to be saying, meet me on the corner and bring your guns and so we can go shoot those people. So the law is again, the trigger's high. And I'll close with this, just to kind of give you a sense of some of the trickiness of the world that we live in, that I live in. We, about 3 or 4 months ago, maybe longer, we kicked InfoWars off of YouTube. Seems like a perfectly obvious and simple thing to do, right? This is as clear of bad actors as one could find. There was a huge outcry on the extreme right against this. Including from the White House and including the Justice Department investigations. InfoWars. So that's why I say these things, and we can talk about the potential for better law and regulation, but we're in a political environment where not going to happen.
I think it's worth noting here, or underlining something that Richard just said, which is your law about hate speech is extremely relaxed here. Don't forget, there are quite a lot of other countries in the world with very much tougher hate speech laws than you have. So one solution, if people still think it's a problem here, is tighten the law, quite simply. But I was also talking about curation and amplification, and I think both of those things are relevant. Richard is talking about de-ranking bad material and kicking any of these people off the major networks does not have complete effect. In other words, it does not suppress them, but it really does reduce the number of people who will see what they say. That seems to me to be about the right kind of thing. And I just repeat, so I'll do it very briefly, my point about amplification. If there was a better handle on amplification, and here I think AI might have a role to play, then that will do something for that as well.
Last question before I dig into this fabulous stack of very, very long questions. Is this question of outrage and the way our lizard brains seem to lead us to headlines that trigger our sense of outrage. If you're liberal and you're looking for liberal outrage, you put conservative or conservative outrage, but the through line there is outrage. And yeah, as a reporter, I'm consistently amazed, like, I think you were referring to this earlier, Richard, right? Like, the thoughtful, well-researched article that considers the various angles. No, if there's some alarming picture and a headline that says we're all going to die because of this guy, that's the article that gets clicked on, and it's true on, reputable news sites as well as any others. What can AI, what can technology do to change the structure of that, to de-emphasize, if you will, outrage?
The first thing to say is AI is not going to change human nature. And human nature enjoys sensation, outrage, and so on and so forth. I was writing a J school in a London university a few years ago, and I was writing a blog, and I was naturally interested that people saw my blog. And it is very, very evident if you do that kind of thing, that if you're attacking people, more people read what you do. Then I discovered, and another discovery, that if you attack Australians, don't ask me why, it goes really well. And then I started attacking, this was before he became really famous, Julian Assange, and I went off the charts. The combination was absolutely, absolutely brilliant. One of his followers, who got very angry with me, called me a supercilious weasel, and I was very tempted to call the blog the Supercilious Weasel. Sensational headline writing is not new.
It bleeds, I have nothing to add to what George said.
Oh dear. Well, let's start in on these questions, and bear with me, I forgot to bring my glasses tonight, so this might be a little bit of a strain. Speaking of norms, where should tech norms come from? Tech companies? The current government locks the understanding to get these norms without hindering potential and growth. What companies are doing a good job of setting norms or creating a process with which to establish norms?
I think this is one of these things, there isn't a particularly good answer to that, though I must say, I've been a little bit frustrated of late where just the very concept of tech company is bad. And I understand, like in any industry, there are bad actors and bad players. And I can tell you, in the last few years, I've been doing my damnedest to kind of create distance between us and the players who are not terribly thoughtful and principled players. And I won't name names. I like to think that what we do is very principled. And again, it's just me saying this, but I've been at Google for 10 years. And I've been just extraordinarily impressed at every step of the way at how thoughtful people are about everything. Not that we always get it right, or nor are there things that we could do better. We're a big company with 100,000 employees. So I don't really know what the answer is, except that I struggle with the notion of these simplistic labels of a whole industry based on the behavior of a few. I mean, obviously we can look at the press in that regard. I mean, I have a very high sense of what, the principles and ethics are of the press, but good Lord, that ranges from, that broadly across the spectrum.
Terrific to terrible.
I'm gonna go Google bad tech companies, because that's the best place to get your information. It's a little hard to make that standard. I do think, the standard of tech companies, are we talking about sort of industry best practices, the way you get in a trade organization? Because you've got medical tech companies, and you've got, biomedical tech companies, you've got internet tech companies, you've got a whole range of tech. Are we talking about media sort of oriented tech companies? I guess. They got regulation with the FCC, they got regulation in Congress, they got, people are hashing through this, it's new territory. I'm not sure you want them forming an industry group and stating things.
And you could argue that those industry groups are already trying to pervert the political process. I felt like I reported on that this week.
I'm the only frog on this log who isn't from Google, so let me say something nice just for a moment about Google. About 15 years ago, Google people went around the world saying to, and would meet from time to time people in newspapers, and I was working in a newspaper at that point, and highly intelligent, highly paid Google people sat across the table from us, and we would say, look, you're giving us a certain amount of problem here or there or otherwise. And they would say, oh, nothing to do with us, we're not a media company. And you would think, okay, how do we get this conversation back on, moving again? And then, before Richard arrived at Google, I think, something happened in Google. I think it was the arrival of Eric Schmidt as the chief executive, but I'm not certain. And clearly, I'm just guessing here, one day, Schmidt summoned the head Googly for news and said, what is all this story about how we have nothing to do with the news and we don't affect it and we're not a media company? And it was explained to him. And my guess is that Schmidt said, Richard of course can correct me if he knows the right story, said, no, sorry, that simply isn't going to convince anybody. Go away and find something better. We are relevant to what happens in the news. You might not like it, you might not even think it's logical, but we're going to have to do something about it. And things like the Digital News Initiative, which Richard started, has emerged from that. It's given an enormous amount of support to experimental and innovative journalism. Norm setting, however, in Europe we have something called the right to be forgotten. Do I need to explain briefly the right to be forgotten, or is it known about? Okay. The Chief Privacy Council at Google, when the rows were winging back and forth about the right to be forgotten and the law and the legal judgment started it, said, and while we're dealing with all these requests to de-index Google searches about people who think they've been harmed by appearing too high in searches, we're creating all this fantastic jurisprudence. A slightly cheeky way to put it, because he didn't mention at the time, they were doing it almost entirely in secret. I don't think that we should be privatizing all of these norms and how they operate. Inside private companies, not always, some of it is inevitably inside private companies, but that's why we need accountability and audit.
So two things, by the way. On the right to be forgotten, I think it was a problematic piece of legislation because it basically asked Google to make the decisions about what should be forgotten and what should not.
Absolutely.
Right? And there was reason for that secrecy, though we've been very transparent. I mean, we had huge numbers of people doing that. But that's a problematic piece of legislation. I will say, I think the biggest challenge in organizations like ours, and I think this is something that's probably gradually, happened over time, is in a sense naivete. Right? We don't know what we don't know. We don't necessarily, these are engineers. They don't understand the news business. They don't understand the media business. And obviously that's not necessarily, you could say the same. I mean, journalists don't understand the tech space. But I think that element of naivete is something that
is it naivete, or is it growing reliance on advertising and how that skews?
No, it's naivete, because I want to be clear here. We have, back to how we operate, there's a really hard wall between the advertising side of our business and the product side of our business. We do with Google Search, an incredibly hard wall. We have a policy internally called the honest results policy, which means that somebody on the ad side of the business side can't come to us and say, oh, by the way, they're having a problem with our ranking. Can you help them out? We won't ever go there. We want them to go there. So no, I think it is very much naivete. And I mean, in a sense, all of us have suffered from some degrees of naivete in terms of the internet, right? I, for one, like many people, I just somehow believed that the better angels of our nature would win out. And it's proving to be a little bit more complex than that.
Yes, it has.
One more
This-
thing.
okay, yes.
You ever heard of Google dancing?
No.
About 15 years ago, techies on the West Coast would sort of notice if Google was experimenting with the search algorithm. They called it Google dancing. There'd be this, Google is dancing, and they'd figure out, what the changes were so they could game them and try and figure out how to game the search results. If you have a high level of transparency about how search is carried out, I do believe the Internet Research Agency in Russia is going to want to look at that. So there's a lot of institutional reasons to worry about what transparency could mean.
I would love to keep charging through these questions, but we've hit 8:10. How do people feel about going on, or maybe just individually approaching the panelists after?
I'll continue.
Read to the crowd?
Time for a few more questions.
All right, cool. So the platforms, especially social media platforms, make money from engagement. And the more eyeballs and interests are on something, the more money the platform makes. Inflammatory content is the most engaging because it co-opts human instincts. And here comes the question. How do the business models of the platforms need to change to address this tendency?
First of all, let's be clear. Media has been driven by attention since the day media was created.
That's true.
There's nothing new here.
We're a celebrity.
I find that when people raise that quotes platforms are driven by attention, I say, well, there's nothing new here. Nothing new here at all. But again, as I said earlier, dangerous to use the term platforms because these are very different environments, right? Well, what motivates us with search, is are we doing the right job that people will want to come back and search again? It's not that they come hang out and search, not at all. I think the intention issues are more about what happens in the media space, honestly. It's like, clickbait headlines, not going to get you over to my site. So I think that's a little bit, simplistic to say, oh, how do the platforms, how do we better manage the platforms to not so be driven by attention?
Well, you can really see it on YouTube. I wouldn't be the first one to suggest that the algorithms are designed to keep you on the site, looking at something. And, numbers push the viewership towards increasingly extreme or bizarre content.
Well, there's no question, YouTube, and again, that's why I say, these platforms are different. YouTube, usually different from Google Search and Google News, right? And yes, no question, YouTube time on site is something that they look at. What I bristle at is the notion, we're not trying to push people towards extremist content. We do try to detect your interest and feed that. I like woodworking, and so if I look at a woodworking video, they're going to show me more woodworking videos. But this is a tricky thing. One of the unfortunate secondary consequences of concerns about fake and extremist content was, as a result, there was a big huzzah where you hear big advertisers, and it's always interesting when big advertisers start getting a little bit self-righteous and say, oh, we're going to pull our advertising off of YouTube or whatever. What that ended up was demonetizing a whole lot of really good content, including, for instance, human rights organizations, trying to provide good information to people. So these are tricky subjects, but I can assure you, no one at YouTube is saying, oh, we want to drive more time on site by getting people in front of extremist content.
In fact, I spent 10 years doing a show on Fox, and those guys are really, really good at measuring stuff. And they measure attention, and they basically view their audience as sitting there with a click in their hand, and you have to hold them, right? And that's why you'll have news alerts over Dow closes up 20 points, or you'll have Fox Extra, or you'll have somebody else talking. There's just a lot of activity there because they want to keep you, they want to hold you, they want to make sure you think something else is coming up, they want you to have your riveted attention. It's not so different. These are industry dynamics. They aren't internet dynamics per se.
Yeah, but there are one or two things that are different about online. Firstly, it is the scale on which this can occur.
Yes.
So let's look at the Facebook example. I mean, I think it was a mixture of naivety, being driven by a business model, which, as you say, does depend on attention. Now Facebook has to answer the question, can we run a business model which doesn't just do everything we want to do? As a business problem, I hope that's how they look at it. As a business problem, that isn't an unprecedented one. They're just going to have to adapt. I see some signs that they're doing it. Are they adapting as fast as people would like? No, certainly not. Will they get it all right? Almost certainly not. But there are some, they're being forced to adapt by some things. And I think one or two, I'll come back to the matter of algorithmic transparency if I get a chance. But I think regulation is probably going to do some of that work for us.
I think fake news is appealing because it is simplistic, and our brain has a natural tendency to simplify information into digestible chunks, whereas truth inevitably is more complex and harder to grasp.
Your words, not mine.
My question is, how can we help people recognize that reality is not straightforward? Can technology play a role in this regard, or should we just accept that this is a human ineptitude?
I will say, as I noted earlier, human reason, I think this is, our species is driven towards those modes of thinking. I don't think it's a problem that gets solved with technology. I mean, obviously, to the extent that we with technology can do a better job, as I said, of surfacing the right information to the right people, yes. But changing the human condition and prevalence towards content that reaffirms what I believe or want to believe, I don't know how to address that with technology.
There was a great technology thinker named T.S. Eliot, and he wrote, "They dream of a world so perfect they won't have to be good." In the public health crisis I'm describing, where people have to live in ambiguity in a high information environment, yeah, learn to encounter difference. Learn that being wrong is actually interesting and kind of good, because that's the first step to learning. These are actually social things we can reinforce, get people out of their environments. Not to toot my own horn, but I volunteer at San Quentin. And I do that in part because I think it's a good thing to do, but also, yeah, I get a lot of love for my name up there. It's just a really great time to encounter people who haven't had my experience. And I actually love it for that reason. It's really just, I learned so much about America.
I'm going to always refer to you as Saint Quentin from now on.
No, it's not. It's selfish. And I think those things could be stitched in better. That could be part of high school, right?
So one last question, because otherwise, seriously, we'd be here all night. And this one is to Quentin. How does Google Cloud employ a director of editorial? This actually mentioned is asked by Rick Ross. So
are you my boss? Because I'm valuable.
I'm sure you are. I just have no idea what the connection between editorial and cloud is.
Because the woman who hired me felt that my analytic skills would be of great service in helping people understand this technology and how much it was going to change the world. On a kind of selfish basis, that's kind of what I was doing at the New York Times. My feeling is cloud is at the center of an extremely dramatic change that is reshaping civilization. And the more I can help people understand that, and the more I can help them sort of realize it's not as wildly technical as they think, or as mysterious as they think, and help them envision a place in it, the more I can help them move into the future, the better off everybody is, the less disruption there is. And also, yeah, I just kind of enjoy, and they enjoy having me demystify complicated things, because it's touching all aspects of the corporation, not just IT people. It touches marketing people, it touches HR people. So they need a way to understand how this stuff is working.
So it's not editorial with regard to content on the cloud.
I've published in Harvard Business Review, I've published in blog, I have a newsletter.
So it's helping people understand the cloud.
Yeah.
Okay.
Subsets of that. I wrote a thing on microservices and
Okay. I get it.
machine tools.
If I can build on that, I do think one thing that is important for folks in the tech space to do, and I'll say this very specific to Google as well, is we need to figure out and understand how to do a much better job of explaining ourselves, of explaining how we work, of explaining the technologies and the implications and how we want to manage those. It is, and I've been saying this, like what I've been saying internally a lot lately is, look, the world has woken up to the impact of the internet on our societies, on our cultures, on the media space, the political space, the industrial space. And Google specifically is right in the middle of it.
Yeah.
Right. And so,
We like
there's a huge interest in our part in getting that right. But I think it goes beyond Google. Because technology, the progression of technology is going to change. Our ability to deal with the cultural impacts of technology is only going to grow. A guy named William Osgood in the early 50s said one of the challenges of technology is often there's a cultural lag, that it takes a long time for a culture to understand the impact of the technology. So I think we in the tech space need to do a better job of that. Robotics, right? The potential in robotics is vast, but how do we help people understand the impact and how it can be used and drive the right principles?
It's what used to be called public relations.
No, but yes,
I mean,
but I want
in a neutral sense.
No, I understand, but it's,
It's a valuable function.
I'm only thinking of it in the sense that an exponential way, because in our world today, I don't think it's as simple as public relations.
you ever see the
It's got to
industrial
be
movies
incorporated
GE did in
into
the
the way we
60s?
think.
Do you ever see the industrial movies GE did in the 60s? They used to show them in my school.
Yes.
You know, you probably couldn't get away with that now, but it was really good contextualization for where the world was going.
And I think it's important for us, one thing I'll say, and I'm sorry, people often ask me, particularly with all the work we're doing in the news industry, say, like, why are you doing all that stuff? Oh, $300 million. Is that just because you want more friends in the publishing industry? I say, well, no question. Having more friends is a good thing. But
It's a side benefit.
But I say, also understand our core business motivations of us as Google. Google search, the relevance and power of Google search is dependent on there being a rich ecosystem of knowledge out there in the open internet. Right? It's in our interest to ferment that, to enable it. Our ad technologies, which are used by 1 million publishers around the globe, where they use our technologies, our services, and they keep 70+% of the revenue, and that's driven $15 billion last year in the publishing industry. That only succeeds to the extent that those organizations are successful on the open internet. So, yeah, we have societal high-level principles of saying journalism is important to society, information is important to society, fact-based knowledge is important to society, but with Google specifically as a platform, our unique platform, it is core to our business. In fact, that's why I worked there, because I felt Google was the one company in this space that could have most significant impact. You know, if we think clearly, if we have the right principles, and we keep at it, and we keep at it, and keep at it. But I think it's always good to explain your business motivations. I was meeting with someone on our robotics side recently, who was looking to do some experiments about robots in the workplace, and they showed some nice videos about, their thoughtfulness about ethics and so on. And I said, the one thing that's missing from this is explaining the business motivation that can convince people that not only do you have ethics, but you have a business motivation to maintain those ethics.
I think I can just about segue from the issue of explanation to go back momentarily to algorithmic transparency. It's true to say that this is a complicated thing to do, and I skimmed over the surface of the issue when I was speaking. Of course, I don't want algorithmic transparency to put the algorithms in the hands of people who are going to game them, nor do I wish to give them to bad states or whatever it is. But what I would say is this: let's take an example outside news. In the next 10 years, there is going to be an enormous amount of online work with big data and health. I can guarantee you, before I even know what these are going to be, that there will be some shocking controversies about whether or not one tech firm or another, I'm just generalizing, some firm operating in this space will have done something controversial. At that point, an independent audit is the best way of discovering what has occurred as the beginning of remedying it. If that involves looking at the algorithm, that's the power the law should have.
Well,
I addressed that earlier, and I think there are appropriate ways to do that. But I'll also note that when we talk about algorithms and machine learning, this is everywhere now, right? I mean, it's what your insurance company has been using for years to set the rates. It's everywhere. And so when we think about that, we need to kind of keep that in context. But there's no question that as technology evolves, how do we as a society and how do we, through law as necessary, guide and manage the legal principles whereby to drive hopefully better behavior and reduce, if not capture and punish nefarious behavior.
Well, hopefully we've inspired you to come up with some solutions because we're in desperate need of them. I'm passing the mic now to Nikki after thanking you guys.
Thank you, Rachel. My name is Nikki Santo. I'm the president of the Harvard Club of Silicon Valley. And before we end this evening's program, I would be remiss if I didn't thank some very important people for tonight's presentation. First and foremost, I'd like to thank my friend and colleague, Dr. Bharti Kansara, for helping do so much work to put this together from an idea spoken over a good dinner, which is always where the best ideas come from, to tonight's program. Tonight's program has been a joint presentation of the Harvard Club of Silicon Valley, SOAS, University of London Alumni Organization, and the Oxford and Cambridge Alumni of Northern California. I'd like to especially thank our host for this evening, Morgan Lewis, for their support of this program and other programs like it. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us, but please join me in thanking George, Richard, Quentin, and Rachel for a stimulating evening and time well spent.